Hey there, Banditos. Thank you for joining us and coming back to another episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits on this Wednesday, December 7th. I am Joe Marcello.
I'm Warren Phillips.
I'm Mike Farah.
And today we're bringing you yet another interview of awesomeness. But more than that, it's an Oren only episode. So what can I say? It's just great guests and Oren all by himself.
Oh my god!
And yeah, it's great.
When
And
are the t-shirts coming?
Oren only. So we're bringing you our interview with Mike Gold. Mike Gold's career is full of firsts. He was a first PR person for the comic book industry as it pertains to DC Comics. He was also the co-creator of First Comics.
Yes, and at first he was the editor for Jon Sable Freelance, my favorite book. So I spoke to him a lot about that. It was so cool to hear his experience and what it was like working with Mike Grell on that series.
Yeah, a lot of great books at first, and also edited quite a bit at DC. And one of the interesting little factoids is that he was the editor for the Impact line of comics, which was kind of a pocket universe almost within DC in the early 90s, where they introduced some new characters and tried to get some new readers as a result. I really liked it. I know Oren did too, and I'm sure Joe does as well. So we'll hear about all that and more with Mike Gold.
Mike Gold, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. A huge, huge fan. First question that we ask everybody: how did you get into comic books?
Long story.
All right.
But I was precocious as hell. My sister was 7 years older than me, which meant that she would be drafted to be my babysitter, which she was not happy about at all.
Mm-hmm.
But she was a comics fan. She was also a very early rock and roll fan. So I grew up with rock and roll and comic books in the house, which made me the man I am today. And she would read me. I remember like she thought that Mutt and Jeff would be a good place to start because I was just a little kid, like 3. And I learned how to read from her reading me those comics. And then I discovered that, look, they're in the newspaper. And I started reading the newspaper. So I was just the most precocious little bastard you ever met, because I could sit there and talk about what President Eisenhower was doing.
Mm-hmm.
And like 5-year-olds, they're not supposed to do that. But the comic book part and the rock and roll part, and I guess the politics part, have all stuck with me.
Mm-hmm.
So I have been reading comics ever since. My sister, God bless her, had a stash of old comics. So I even got to read like early 50s, really early 50s comics, quite a few.
Right.
At a point in time when, there were no comic shops, of course. And it was just a wonderful thing to be turned on to because I was the perfect age for it. My sense of wonder was expanding.
Mm-hmm.
And comics really helped guide my path in terms of this sort of surreal expansionist view of the world. And I'm grateful for that. My sister died about 2-3 years ago, and okay, I mean that makes sense. She's 7 years older than me, but she could never understand why I said if not for you, I would not have a career. I would not have these careers, the ones that I have now. I mean, I might have been doing something like curing cancer or something, but no, I'm doing comic books. Fine.
So how did you tell yourself, okay, this was a career I wanted to pursue?
I never did. That's a good question. I was always a comics fan, and I was one of the organizers of the original Chicago Comic Con, which was the first show was in 1976. I think we started working on it in 74. certainly 75. And I was doing some sort of business consulting with a couple of the comics retailers because that was when the direct sale thing was starting to happen. And in those days, and pretty much today, a comics retailer knows how to run a store, a good one, but doesn't have necessarily a lot of experience doing the other stuff. Do you realize that by ordering non-returnable, you're committing a payment of certain amount of stuff, and you're going to make that payment, at least in the beginning, before you get any of the money back. So you're going to need it. You're going to have these cash flow problems, that sort of thing. And I was enjoying it because these guys are my friends. What happened was I was doing a project called National Runaway Switchboard. I've done a lot of youth social services work, drug abuse education, this runaway program, and several other things. Head started. Very politically active. And among the work that I had done in helping set up the National Runaway Switchboard, was to promote the service. And a magazine being published by Scholastic, their editors called me up and said, "Hey, let's do a story." And we did that. We had a great time. We just had a fabulous time doing this story. I'm guessing I was flirting like a son of a bitch, but it didn't matter. I do that. I'm doing that with you. And she mentioned it in great detail to her boss, who was Jeanette Kahn. And Jeanette got a hold of me to thank me for the piece when it came out. And we developed a friendship. And she began to understand my background, which is great because most people don't. And it's complicated. It seems linear to me, but it's not. Mm-hmm. And we talked comics back and forth. And one day, this is now January, February 1976, she's made publisher at DC Comics. So I call her up and said, congratulations. She knew about my interest in comics. I knew about hers. And I invited her to be our co-guest of honor, along with Stan Lee and Harvey Kurtzman at our first Chicago Comic-Con. And, she accepted. We had these sort of twice a week telephone conversations. They would last forever. And we talked about everything. So one day she calls me up and she says, "There's a job opening, but over at Neil Adams' studio, Continuity Associates." And I knew that Dick Giordano had left Continuity. And I pretty much had the idea that I didn't really want to work for Neil Adams. Nothing wrong. I mean, Neil, brilliant. I mean, maybe not the best businessman in the world, but he was damn good at it. He made a lot of money at it and did a lot of good work. So who am I to bitch? But, he had a very strong personality in order to do all this, which is fine. That's what it takes often in the creative fields. So I had no problem with that. It's just that I don't like bureaucracy, which means that this story is going to have a very sad ending. And she said, "Why don't you fly out here?" I was living in Chicago. "Why don't you fly out here and we'll have dinner or we'll have lunch with Neil and we'll talk about it. And I'll give you a tour of DC." What? Hell? What? Yes? What? Okay. Now, I knew Neil because by that point he'd been working with Stuart Gordon, the director, the Reanimator and things like that. But he was a stage director doing Warp and doing Bleacher Bums and Eon and all kinds of brilliant stage productions, really bizarre stuff. And Neil was going to do some artwork, did do some work actually for the Broadway version of the Warp plays. So he came out to Chicago to see the plays and to talk with him. And that's where I met him. because I was a regular at the Organic Theater Company, which is the name of the organization. And you know, it was nice. It was cool meeting Neil, and I'd seen him at conventions, things like that. We had conversations, but I really didn't go out there to take that job. It wasn't very creative. It was a very management oriented job, and that just wasn't where I was at that moment of my life. However, I was, as they say in the business, between jobs on radio. Because back in the 70s, radio stations were supposed to be profitable, and they would change their formats about every 20 minutes. So you really couldn't make a long-term commitment to, you know, they don't put your name up in the parking lot. All right? It was like, whomever. Okay, great. So I was between radio jobs. And, you know, I loved the tour of DC because the little fanboy heart was just going thumpity thump. I mean, I had a wonderful time. And of course, by this point, Jeanette was quite a friend, and I had known a few writers and artists, but I had met these editors whose work I grew up on, starting with Julie Schwartz, which is this really as far as you need to go, but I met all the others too, right? And you know, I thanked Jeanette at the end because I had a wonderful time, but Neil didn't show up for the lunch, which is funny because I came in from Chicago and I did. But, okay, that happens. Jeanette and I sat at the 21 Club, which was a very famous club right across the street from DC, which was known for having these lawn jockeys, these 21 lawn jockeys. And when they had to remove them for aesthetic reasons, they went out of business, quite frankly. They survived Prohibition, but they couldn't survive that. Okay, that's what happens. And we had this 3-hour lunch conversation. And we were both very passionate about it because we bring out each other's passions. And she had pretty much just taken the job at DC, 6 months. So we're talking comic books aggressively. Very, very important to us. And all these businessmen, this is long before, you know, the first Superman movie. Well, it's 2 years before the first Superman movie, which was the beginning of the medium being taken seriously. So all these businessmen at the 21 Club who were sitting around us, I think they were scared shitless. It's like these two adults, I mean, I was still sort of a hippie, but these two adults are batshit. Oh, yeah, we are. Fine. Deal with it. Wonderful conversation. Had the tour at DC, got on the plane, flew home, having had a fabulous day. She calls me up the next morning. She says, you know, I've been thinking it over. I don't want you to take this job with Neil. To which I did not say, yeah, I wasn't planning on it anyway, because, you know, it seemed rude. She said, I want you to work for me. I said, whoa, what? See what? What? I mean, I'd spent an enormous amount of time in New York City. Anybody in the media business certainly did, certainly in those days. And I liked New York. It wasn't a goal to live there, but, you know, it was fine. But to work in the comics business, to work at DC, and to do something that really had never been done before, because I was doing promotion work and doing the direct sales promotion work. So I was kind of like their first marketing director, kind of. And that was very interesting because I was working with editorial on how to make DC's books in the mid-70s appeal more to the burgeoning direct sales market, comic book stores. So I got to work in editorial with editorial. Now I have a strong editorial background, but not in comics. I brought my journalistic background into the work, um, which was interesting because most editors don't have any training at all. There's no training for a comic book editor, which is a shame. Now they won't do it because they don't want to give those people the power.
Right.
Not a problem for me a couple of years later when I went back to DC as a senior editor because I'm an authoritarian little mother, and that's what I do. So, reference my note about bureaucracy. I'm the out of the box guy. And I know by this point, and now I'm referring to, we're jumping ahead to 86 when I went back to DC, January 86, after First Comics. I knew that the out of the box guy is only valuable to corporate America until you don't need the out of the box thinking, because the out of the box thinking was successful. So you revert back to the way you were before, slowly but surely, and all of the gains that you made previously kind of dissipate over the years. And that's a very sad experience. But I figured, 5 years, let's see what I can do. And I stayed 7 years, for 6 of which were great fun. And the last year was just winding up. Somebody said, guy from Warner Publishing said I'd spent the whole year packing my parachute. And I had to agree with that. Yeah, that's exactly what I was doing. Giordano and I left at almost the same time. We had a whole deal worked out. And I was already planning on doing this other thing. And Dick knew about it because I told him, and he was going to do a graphic novel for it. Now, we didn't do any of that work while either of us were at DC. Just because, lawyers make enough money. And good lawyers make enough money. And that's fine. So I get to DC, and we're now in 1986. And Dick, based on my work at First Comics, Dick says to me, what we really want is, it would be great if you could bring some of the folks you worked with over at First Comics. And I said, oh, you mean the way they hired you when you were at Charlton and you brought all those people with you? And Dick laughed his ass off and said, yes. Now, the place where we had this conversation was up here in Connecticut, where I live now, not far from where I live, a mile and a half away from where I'm sitting right now. And it was a bar that all of the cartoonists would go to on Wednesdays to deliver their artwork to the courier they hired, who would take it get on the train, take it into the city, while the other guys just sat around and got drunk around 10 in the morning. And we were sitting at that bar when we were having this conversation. He told me that. I thought, oh, that's really well played. That's really well played. And then he tells me that Erwin Donenfeld, who was publisher of DC and editorial director in the 50s and succeeded his father, his office, he when he sold the company, he started up like a boating supplies company or something, was about a block away. I thought, oh, that's kind of cool. I wound up meeting him and having lunch with him and stuff several times after that. So the whole fanboy thing just keeps on being fed. So I take the job that he offered me. I said, yeah, I like working with my friends. Don't worry about that part. Particularly since I knew my friends were frustrated with First Comics for the same reasons why I was. The distributors were going out of business. They owed all the smaller publishers, by smaller, I mean smaller than DC and Marvel, which had 75% of the market. So, we were pretty small. But still, we were making an impact and we were changing policies. So it was an important thing. It was an important moment. He knew that I didn't like working in a bureaucratic environment. And having worked at Warner Communications before, And at DC, which was part of Warner Communications, I knew that was about as bureaucratic a place as you can. But the salvation was that nobody cared. You couldn't even find DC Comics in their annual report back in pre-Christopher Reeve days.
Yes.
So, I thought I could probably get through this, but he wanted me to change everything to really kick ass. Why the hell? So, I'm bringing in my buddies, Grell and Truman and Ostrander. Ostrander was the first one that brought over. And Chaykin, who it was a big return. He wasn't thrilled with the idea of working for GC. Nor was Mike Grell, because he got into trouble with one of their executives the first time around, and now that executive was publisher. So he thought it wasn't going to work. And I said, but no, you're not working for them. You're working with me. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can do that. I don't know. Maybe not. I don't know. I really don't like the company. What do you got in mind? And I said, okay, I do have a project. And I said, I would like you to take over Green Arrow. He says, Green Arrow. He had done it before. He'd followed Neil Adams. All roads lead to and which seems fair for some reason. So he said, Green Arrow. I says, yeah. He says, wow, I did that before. I like the character. It's a good character, but I don't know if I really want to do that. And I said, well, I've got a starting point for you. He says, yeah, what's that? You may have to bleep this. I said, urban hunter. And Mike, long pause. And Mike goes, you motherfucker. So that was a small triumph.
You hooked him.
I'll be on a panel in a couple of weeks in Baltimore with Mike and Tom King, who's just brought the Warlord back to DC. And in continuity, Warlord wants to join the Justice League. And Mike had always kept the Warlord outside of the DC universe. He realizes he doesn't know the characters. That's not the problem.
Right.
But, it's not something that he would ever do. Mm. So I mentioned this to Bob Harrison, who's a friend of ours who works with the Pop Culture Squad. Mm. And this is a brilliant, wonderful guy. He hosts a lot of panels. And I said, and he's a friend of Tom's. Mm. I've met Tom a few times. I don't really know him. And I said, well, Grell's kind of up in arms about this, but just personally up in arms. So let's do a panel. So we're doing the Tom King, Mike Grell panel. We're calling it the King Grell panel. It'll be the end of this month. And I'm looking forward to it like you wouldn't believe. So that's sort of how I got into the comics business.
Yeah.
I never stopped my political work. And quite frankly, my work at DC, both in the 70s and when I came back in the 80s and 90s, helped subsidize that. So I was happy as a clam because I'm doing everything that I enjoy doing, except radio.
Yeah.
I had to wait for the internet to come along before I went back to radio. I did an internet radio show for like 9 years. But I was happy as a clam. I'm doing everything that I want to do in life.
That's all you can ask for.
Yeah, it really is. I'm the luckiest son of a bitch in the world.
That's awesome.
If you just keep what you want and what you are good at and what makes you happy, you keep that in mind and you work towards that, it's like eating a sandwich. It really is. So I'm very happy. I look back on all this stuff and I'm still doing a little bit of work in comics. Probably would be doing a little bit more if not for the whole COVID thing, which just obviously stopped everything.
Right.
And I've moved on to the sort of elder statesman role. not as good at it as Paul Evans, who's made a third career out of that, and he's doing a wonderful job, as she points out. And I'm happy. We every once in a while we talk about doing a project. Every once in a while I talk about, well, maybe we can raise a couple of $1 million and do something here, which is easy to say. That is part of my life. Actually getting around to doing that part, not as attractive. Not as attractive. Because people don't pony up money because, they like your t-shirt.
Right.
And boom.
I do like your t-shirt. I was going to say.
My favorite Marvel character. And, they give you money with contracts and with bureaucracy, and then they don't honor their end of the contract. So, and a lot of lawyers and stuff. I've done all that, done it a lot. I don't need to really go out of my way to do that again. But if there's a really cool project with some good people, and oddly enough, I'm more interested in working with younger talent than geriatrics I've always worked with. I would take it up. I would probably take it up if I thought, it had a chance of succeeding.
Right. I want to jump back to start off at DC and you're doing the PR. Marvel at the time, they had Stan Lee doing interviews left and right, love talking to the camera.
Stan saved the industry. He's a very controversial guy, and I agree with not all of it, because some of it's bullshit, but I agree with the truthful parts. No person is perfect, and creators have a creative ego. And even if it's a small company, which Marvel was, pretty much up until Disney, it takes a big ego to push that stuff through the system. But Stan was up there on TV talk shows, Dick Cavett and Merv Griffin and all the guys who were around back in the 70s after the Batman TV show was over, but before the Superman movie. And he was making comics cool on college campuses, which was the first thing that broke out of the whole imagery of comics are for kids. By the way, comics should be for kids.
Right.
We have ignored this audience way too long. And who's going to buy this stuff 10 years from now, 20 years from now? Right now we're living on the fact that parents who are comic book readers are shoving it down their kids' throats. And the movies and stuff, that helps, but it's not a big deal. Not like the Batman TV show where all of a sudden Batman was selling millions of copies. And it raised the bar for everybody else. Tower Comics was in business, and Archie dragged out their characters, and Marvel really made the best of it by flim-flamming DC with this 48-page format, and Marvel wound up taking over as the industry leader. And that was all Stan. I mean, I'm not saying Martin Goodman didn't make some of those decisions and stuff, but promoting it, getting people excited about it, going on television, talking to talent, bringing in talent, getting Jack Kirby back, things like that. That made the comic book a business. That kept us in business because all of the places where you could buy comics were going out of business. Comics were not, and still aren't really, expensive enough to generate any real income for, a big department store, for Walmart or something like that. It's if you're in a mall, you're paying rent by the amount of profit you make per square foot, which is why the comic spinner rack takes a square foot. And they were going out of business. newsstands were dying. I mean, there were a few in New York, a few in the big cities, big eastern cities. You couldn't find them in California, or very few. Um, there was no place to really buy comics. You didn't fall across it. It's not something that kids could normally experience as part of their routine day. And the comic book shops in those days were just selling back issues. And there weren't that many of them. And they were in pretty skeevy neighborhoods, by and large. Some of my favorite neighborhoods, but pretty skeevy nonetheless. And I firmly believe that if not for Stan, the whole thing would have gone away. So we owe him for that, if nothing else, and we owe him for a lot of other things too. So that's my Stan Lee story.
I was going to say, do you think DC not having a figurehead like that hurt them? And while you were there, was there ever any thought as to try to push somebody into the spotlight to maybe take that kind of position?
No, because it would be transparent. It's like, oh, that guy's trying to be Stan Lee. Right. Or Jeanette is trying to be Stan Lee, which was impossible. They were good friends, actually. So that was an interesting experience. But no, I don't think the personality way was doing that. I think the best bet was to help take advantage of what Stan was doing for the industry. And he was in favor of that because he didn't think we were ripping him off or anything like that. I mean, really, we were just taking a seat on his bus. Because the better the industry is doing, the better Marvel is doing, and the better he is doing. He's very smart in that respect. This is Jack Benny philosophy, where you let other people get the jokes because it's your name on the show. Right. So I didn't go that route. I thought that both in the 70s, particularly in the 70s, I thought that the way to do it was to break DC out of its 1960s mentality. Most of the editors there were there 20 years earlier. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, except for the fact that they were producing comics for 8-year-olds and 10-year-olds and 12-year-olds. And the market had changed. The market had aged. And older readers wanted more deeper stories and more continuity and more substance. Also and better art, because, their parents would go like, "You're 17, what the hell are you doing reading comic books?" I said, "Well, look at this." So I thought that changing the editorial content or helping it change, because the younger people, the Denny O'Neills and the Larry Hamas, who became editors during that period of time, and Archie Goodwin had been very active for a while at that point. But that generation of talent wanted to do the same thing. But some of them didn't quite have the mentality of looking at this as a revolution and the bureaucrats be damned, which is probably on my business card. So we had a pretty good time helping DC catch up. It wasn't quite, we didn't hit 1978 and 1978, but we were getting closer, and we were out of 1964. I mean, I swear, DC in those days was just a heartbeat away from going back to go-go checks.
Wow.
So, some of it was very sad. I mean, if you're going to go and revamp the company or make it a little bit more consumer friendly to today's consumer, it means that you're probably going to put another artist on Superman, for example. Let's start there because that's the best Superman. Right. Kirk was wonderful and a phenomenal Superman and a phenomenal artist in every respect, but it was very dated. Jeanette wanted to change artists back in the 70s. She didn't get a lot of support from the staff because, like, you can't put these guys out on the street. The deal was if you made your deadlines and did, relatively good work, you got a job for life. Well, you don't want to screw these people over. They put you where you are today. And she would have been successful if Garcia Lopez or John Buscema wanted to take over Superman. John was just negotiating with DC in order to drive his page rate up at home. Garcia just didn't like doing superheroes. Jose.
Yeah.
Just didn't like doing superheroes. I mean, if there wasn't a horse in it, he wasn't happy. And he's a wonderful guy and a phenomenal artist. And he did do a lot of Superman work, and all of it was great. But time marches on.
No.
Just as you wouldn't use Wayne Boring, who was a Superman artist I grew up with in my precocious days.
Mm-hmm.
Because, that's a very, very, very 1930s dated look. And Boring started on the strip as one of Joe's assistants back in 1939, I believe, 38 to 39. So he really had that 1950s look of Superman running on the air and stuff. And he had it down perfect. But like Dick Sprang, who's a very good friend, his approach to Batman was as opposite of Neil's approach to Batman as humanly possible. Two of them did not overlap. Kurt and everybody else did come to. Mm-hmm. I wound up getting, in 86, the first day I hit the office, Dick says, "Listen, I'd like you to do me a favor." I look at him and go, "A favor?" He says, yeah, I'm your boss. I can order you to do this, but I'm asking you nicely. I said, "Before you order." He said, "Yeah." What? He says, "We have this license for Mask, the toys. We did a miniseries, and it was very successful, and we'd like to do an ongoing series. Can you relaunch Mask? And then after an issue or two, hand it over to one of your staff." Because I had three editors who were working under stuff.
Alongside.
In the same building.
Yeah.
And, Bobby Greenberger really deserved a good shot at being one. So, I took it for that reason, but I told Dick, because I wasn't going to just take the job because he asked me nicely. I got to make it funny. So I'll take it on two conditions. And he looks at me and says, "Two conditions." Like, "Look, I'm your boss, pal." I said, "Yeah. The first is that we get Kurt Swan to pencil." And he looks at me and says, "Yeah, that's perfect." And not only is he right, but it gives him work.
Right.
The second was that Kurt Schaffenberg. Because with that property, it was fine. It was the right people for the job. Mike Fleischer was writing it, but he wasn't writing it the way he wrote, Jonah Hex or the Spectre. So, that's the approach. The approach is you have an assignment, be it Superman or the Flash or whatever, but you get the right talent to do the right job. Now, nobody knows what the right job is. Anybody who says, "Oh yeah, this is going to be a surefire hit," they're idiots. They're idiots. Don't go swimming with them, because if you have a problem, it's your state. But excuse me 1 second.
Bless you.
Sorry about that. You can edit
that. Yeah.
Or just put it on the loop.
That's the whole interview right there.
That's it. Yeah.
That's a gag.
Yeah. But that's the approach. The right people who know how to tell a story, who have an appreciation for what the audience wants out of them, not out of a comic book, but out of them. And that was the big difference between how comic books were produced before that and after that. And that's something, of course, obviously, I learned in first comics.
I was about to say, at first, how did you build the team that you had? Because it seemed like it, like you said before, it was the right people in the right positions because everything clicked.
I had a master plan,
Okay.
which implies I had an attention span. You really don't necessarily have to have both. But I did have a plan. The plan was we would start off with a title that was based on something people knew about, but in all other respects, it would kind of look like a really good Marvel comic.
Mm-hmm.
And that was War.
Yeah.
With Frank Brunner. Frank had made a big thing about a year or two earlier where he had quit Marvel very loudly. And he'd had it with the comics business, and every reason he decided was accurate. So I couldn't fight with that. So I call him up and say, "So you want A, B, C, D?" Yeah. Okay, let's do that. Right guy for the job. Peter Gillis wrote it, Marvel writer. Did a good job. Did a good job. My second was going to be to revive a fan favorite product, because in direct sales you sell comics to the retailer, who in turn sells it to the customer, to the reader. So we picked up the rights to email. We bought outright the rights to email, with a provision that we were going to be turning these rights over to Joe Staton. Nick Cuddy as well, but that was really up to Joe, because Nick was on staff at DC and he couldn't participate in the events at that time. But people knew Joe, they loved Joe's work, and they loved his work on email, and we brought it back and we made it a little bit more contemporary. Old-time fans of email, some of them might say that we made it too contemporary and we lost the essence of email. I don't think we did, but in places we went right up to that one. Which I think, in retrospect, was probably the right way to do it, but that was part of the plan. The third was going to be taking an established talent and give that person a brand new project. Let them create a brand new project, something nobody ever heard of. People had heard of War, whether they saw it or not. People read email, but nobody knew Jon Sable Freelance. And they knew Mike is mostly a fantasy writer and artist, not this hardcore. Now, I had known Mike since 76, so I'd known Mike for 5 years. And I knew the depths of his experience. For a long time, I thought it would be really kind of cool to see who had the bigger gun collection, him or Larry Hama. But he knew he wasn't a gun nut. I mean, he isn't a gun nut. He knows his stuff, and he's very respectful of that. And I'm a city boy, so I needed to learn that, not about Mike, but about Earth. Because it's so easy to just indulge in the cliches. So, and Mike had, over the years, helped me understand that. And I thought Jon Sable was perfect for him, for the market, and for my game plan, which said project number 3, a well-established, well-known talent doing something brand new. The fourth was a revival type project with brand new talent, taking a character that people knew about, in this case, Starslayer, and bringing in people like John Ostrander to write it, and Lennon Del Sol, who went on to become a brilliant painter. Google him, his stuff is breathtaking. And Hilary Barta, and most specifically Timothy Truman. The fifth project was to be something that just nobody had ever seen before. Just way out of left. And in this case, the word left is probably accurate. Howard Chaykin American flag. I've joked about this subsequently, but Howard's career could be put into three phases. First phase is he's ahead of his time. The second phase was American flag. And the third was, hey, wasn't American flag great? At the Baltimore Con, which is my favorite convention, a couple of years ago, a bunch of us were just babbling on the floor. And Howard said, this is what I want on my tombstone, this long thing. And I said, Howard, I hate to do this, but it's way too long. I can do something better. And he says, you're always editing. He says, yeah. He says, okay, come on. All right, put on your tombstone. Am I ahead of my time now? Question mark. He still is. You look at his work. I mean, it's in some ways it's much more personal. Certainly, the Hey Kids comics things. But I think Black Kids was too. I mean, he continued to evolve. But it's going to be American flag that people are going to remember the most. After that was a coup de grace. It was a brand new project that didn't look like anything anybody had ever done before, by people you never heard, by newcomers, essentially newcomers. And we got Mark Wheatley and Mark Temple in Mars. We set both of them up in their careers. And it was brilliant. Led to Breathtaker, which was even brillianter, which we did over at DC, maybe several years later. And is now part of the Norman Rockwell Museum's traveling show about graphic novels, which is seriously good, very seriously good. So we did Mars, and then the next and final step in my master plan to conquer the world was a spin-off. That was GrimJack, because he was a backup in Starship. And that's what First Comics was about. Nexus and the Badger came along because Capital City Comics went bluey, and those projects along with Whisper needed a home and deserved a home. So we provided that out of the graciousness of our hearts, and also they sold really well.
But besides Badger and Nexus, were there ever any other independent books that you would have loved to have brought into your stable?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Thousands of them. Thousands of them. Far more than I could ever print.
Gotcha.
But I do like working on something from the ground up.
Yeah.
With creators. My role is, as editor, to be the catalyst, to work really hard at the creation of it and to add that sort of catalytic energy to it. But I can do that with, half a dozen projects simultaneously.
Right.
Guys who are actually doing the work. They got that one gig. No, the trick is never lose sight of it. These guys are working 7 days a week, 12 hours a day on a slow day to do their masterpiece, because I helped build the stage to do their work on it. And God, that was great. We've seen John Ostrander and I were friends since we met in 1971. I went to a party. It was a theater party. Chicago's theater scene was extremely well developed in those days. I mean, guys like Joey Montaigne, just unbelievable group of people. And John was part of that. And so I go to this party at William J. Norris's house. He just died, but he was a brilliant stage actor. Did some movie work, primarily with Stuart Gordon, but never really cared about movies. He was a stage guy. brilliant actor, best actor I'd seen on stage ever. And he and John were roommates. So I go into this party, 71, and the woman who answered the door knew my name, didn't know me. She says, "Oh, you're one of those comic book guys. Listen, we got a couple of comic book fans over here. Why don't I introduce you to them?" And there was John and two other guys whose names I never found out, sitting on a couch, not happy. And John and I just hit it off. And 5 years later, he was writing one of them. 5 years later, I guess it was more like 10 years later. Mm-hmm. He was writing for me at first.
That's awesome.
And his big question after he'd finished his first script was, "Listen, I hate to bring this up, but do I get paid for this?" Of course you do. It's work. I mean, maybe fulfillment of your life's ambition, but it's still work. You still got to pay for it. And that's wonderful. And now, like last year, you go to the movies and you see the Suicide Squad, which is another important project that spun off of Legends, which is our project. And there's John in the opening scene.
Yep.
He was a stage actor. Didn't do a lot of it, although he did some very prestigious work. And there he was, because the director, who's the hottest director in Hollywood right now, loved John's writing. And when he found out that John was an actor, he said, "Holy crap, he's got to be in the Suicide Squad movie." That was wonderful. It was such a wonderful
that worked out.
And that's the stuff, because if you're working with your friends or people who become your friends because of your work, you want that to happen. It's not just you're making a living and you're doing some great artistic stuff. There should be more to it than that.
Yeah.
The value added stuff. So I'm very happy with that. That's one of the proudest parts of my life.
Well, one thing that I have to thank you, and we had the honor of speaking to Mike Grell to thank him for, is Jon Sable Freelance. That's a book that is very near and dear to my heart. And I think one of the most brilliant parts about that book is there's a lot of action in it, of course, but then you might have an issue that just focused on John's relationship with Mike. And you didn't feel like, oh, this is a toss-away issue. Like, you got yourself invested. It's just him and her talking, going back to, his life. And the fact that that book can go so seamlessly into the whole arc of the stories, it really, for me, separated it from other books that were out there at the time.
Me too.
Yeah.
Me too. That's my favorite aspect. It's, in my opinion, it's Mike's best work, but it's also the most reflective of who he is.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I'm happy about all of the books that we did over first. Most of the books we did at DC after that. But some of them were, because I was director of editorial development, some of them were very experimental in nature. And some just didn't work out, but very few. Others, more likely, such as Breathtaker, were just buried by the marketing department because it didn't have Batman in it.
How did Shatter come about? Because that was one of those ones that it like you said before, things that are sort of ahead of their time, and it was ahead of its time.
Oh, it was for about a minute.
Yeah,
it really was.
Yeah.
That's because Mike Sands is bug fuck. He's an airbrush. He was an airbrush artist.
Mm-hmm.
Did a lot of work for Archie Goodwin over at Epic.
Mm-hmm.
It's really nice. I was familiar with this stuff. He was a Chicago kid. And he saw that very first Macintosh, which today would be thought of as a lead weight. But in 1984, it was a miracle because of the graphic interface.
Mm.
Slow by today's standards, very little power. And he said, "That's my next brush." Okay, pal. What can you do with it? He did like about a half a dozen pages of sample continuity, not really about Shatter necessarily, just what he could do.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm looking at this, the printouts of this stuff. This is before there were even laser printers.
Right.
I mean, laser printers came along a couple of months later, which made it all the better. But he could tell the story with a computer, and nobody was using computers. Very few people owned computers, and a lot of people were scared by them. Computers. Oh my God, that's IBM. That's what you use to the man from Uncle uses to take over the world. I mean, these are computers. No. They're for comic books. And the folks at Apple were amazed. Never thought that anybody could do anything like that. At that moment in their time, they didn't help us much under the table because they were trying to sell themselves as a business machine as well as a consumer machine. And the whole comic book thing made me a little squeamish. Okay, that's fine. We sold about 1.5 million copies of that first Shadow. Peter wrote it and did a lot of work to help keep Mike kind of on schedule and things like that. As did I, as did Rick Oliver, who was at that point my social editor. And it was a lot of work, but boy, it was worth it. And we'll talk about new ground. That was all virgin land.
Yeah.
Every bit of it, every dot on the paper. Pixels, they called them. Oh, really? Stuff that we take for granted today didn't exist the day before we started Shatter. And that's amazing. It's an amazing thing to be part of. I'm so grateful to Mike for that, and to Peter, and also to the people to the money people at First Comics who greenlit it because, well, maybe I didn't give them much of a choice. But democracy starts at home.
Another thing you guys are doing at first that really kind of set things forward going on is you're using really nice paper, high gloss time. The color was beautiful. And, you had the $1 or $1.25 price, but nobody flinched at that price because they knew what they were getting.
Right.
Going to be worth it. You weren't getting ripped off when you were getting a first book.
Yeah, we were. You could just flip through it at the comic book store and stop thinking this is a lot of money.
Yeah,
because it was good looking stuff. We had some brilliant colorists, color artists at home today, and that's fair. And I'm still in touch with all of those people who are still alive, which is almost all of those people. These are lifelong friends. Julia Lockham, who I brought over to DC, among everybody else. I was just writing to her today on Facebook. I mean, we're still really good friends. And they brought that color stuff. Bruce Patterson was our Joe Staton was our art director. Bruce Patterson was our production manager. Both knew their stuff. Bruce really knew color, and he knew how to print color. So I would take his advice to heart when he'd say, it might be better if we did this. Because it might. Let's do that. Building a good crew, a good staff, and it doesn't matter what you're doing, is crucial. It's critical. And most of us knew, at least at most times, that it was an uphill battle. There would be tough days. and there'd be some emotional straining, particularly once the distributors stopped paying in a timely fashion. That was rough. But during my tenure at first, at least, I'm not commenting after that because it wasn't fair. They lost all their talent to DC for some reason. They, you got to have a good crew.
Yeah.
You got to know what you're doing. And also, you need a esprit de corps.
Mm.
We're fighting those people.
Right. We're
not mad at those people. But we're trying to teach the world that came to believe after a ton of hard work that a comic book had the word Marvel. That was what a comic book was. And it was our job to say, no, it's also this, which DC couldn't really do at that time because they were anchored down by the weight of their own legacy, which gratefully was able to help change. But I'll tell you, that whole thing started New Year's Eve, 1973. I think I've told the story. I was in Montreal at a Woolworths. Remember Woolworths? I liked Woolworths. The one in Montreal was like all the other Woolworths, except all the signs were in French. And they have a graphic novel section. They had like these magazine racks with these graphic novels. They were all in French. Well, that makes sense. You're in Quebec. I mean, you can do that. But me, I'm looking at stuff I heard of some of these people. I've seen certain individual pages reprinted in different places. But I'm looking at all of this Giraud and Chevalier, and I'm looking at the stuff I'm saying, we invented this medium. Why can't we do stuff like this? Well, if you try hard enough and you have no sense of reality, you can do that.
There you go.
You can do that. That's the reason why First Comics became First Comics. And I'm glad I was able to bring a lot of that energy and certainly that operating philosophy over to DC. They had, by this point in time, they had, the older guys were gone. They had really good people who had a clue, at least, that it was 1986 and not 1935. I'm lucky enough, fortunate enough, blessed enough to have among my friends Nicky Wheeler Nicholson, whose grandfather started what became DC Comics. He published, the original more fun comics and adventure comics and detective comics. He started that whole thing. And nobody said the stuff that had never happened before can't evolve. Until Frederick Wortham came in. And then Frederick Wortham says, it's not going to evolve, it's going to die. Everybody played it very safe. Almost all the publishers went out of business. Marvel hung in there by the skin of its teeth. They actually stopped buying new material for several months, fired all of the staff except for Stan and a production guy. And, Archie and DC were still around, and Dell was still around. How they did business was totally different in terms of their distribution and stuff. Charlton was around because the mob thought it was funny, and Harvey was around doing 400 different Richie Rich titles, which I made fun of, except for now with Batman and the X-Men. It's not a joke anymore. It's a way of life. So there goes that joke. But it did go out of business. Almost. And then Donenfeld said, let's try superheroes again. To which I'm sure somebody said, well, Marvel tried it. They did a relaunch of their superheroes, their big three. And other people had tried doing new stuff. Charlton did Captain Atom in the late 50s, and nobody was successful at reinventing the superhero, including Captain America and Submariner and Human Torch. So Donenfeld said, let's bring back our characters, but let's bring them up to date. And Julie went and gave us Barry Allen Flash and Hal Jordan Green Lantern. And that type of attitude for what Julie's done, I'm not comparing myself to Julie Schwartz, but Harlan Ellison did. One of the great moments of my life. That philosophy is what I brought back to DC. I'm very with Malice Aforethought, and some people knew exactly because we're all fans here. So they understood that, and that was great. Those were wonderful opportunities. It's just looking at the world, or at least the business place, just a little different. That's how I look at the world.
Well, part of that is also you took some of those older heroes and you brought them in with the Impact line.
The Archie heroes.
Yeah, the Archie heroes. And there's a lot more people now who are appreciating the Impact line because, in a time of the hologram covers and the guys with the giant muscles and the splash pages galore, these were, I want to say, a breath of fresh air because they were just comics. They were telling a story about superheroes. It was, like an old school approach that I felt, and this is just my personal opinion, is that DC did not push those books like they could have. I think.
Well, let me affirm your personal opinion. The project was created by a guy named Matt Ragone, who was the newsstand sales director, and me. Because we were having a conversation, probably over lunch, because we're inexpensive. And said, we need these kids. We need to bring back the kids. We need something that they can understand without having to buy 400 different books and just straight out superhero stories, but not so that they would bore the mainstream. We want to have our cake and eat it too. And we designed the line to do exactly that. Then halfway through, Matt takes this job over at Marvel, where he's sales director at Marvel. And the guy who was running marketing, the head of marketing, a guy named Bruce Bristow, hated because people like Capital City, distribution company, told him that they didn't want comic books for kids. They didn't want to bring kids into the comic book series. And that was not universally shared, but it was by a couple of the big distributors. And he believed that. And so he had this big meeting in Dick Giordano's office with him and me and his assistant, Bob Wayne, and my assistant, Brian Augusta. And Bruce is just screaming his head off, saying, nobody will ever see these comic books. You might as well cancel them right now. Because we're not doing comics for kids. He took it personally because the whole DC, not just for kids anymore, thing in the little UPC boxes, that was his. So he took it as an insult. It's not. It's have your cake and eat it too. So we were obligated to tell everybody who's involved that we might be on a hopeless mission here. Mm-hmm. Not a single talent quit. One or two of the editors did. They saw careers. And I got that. I was a little disappointed because I tend to be kind of a fighter, I guess. I think it's more popularly referred to as a pain in the ass. Mm-hmm. And you don't have. I mean, this was so stunning. Bruce's pronouncement was so vile, loud, and evil that Bob Wayne, who was not a disloyal person, came back after Bruce left. Came back and apologized for Bruce.
Wow.
Now, if Bruce ever hears this, he would fire Bob, except for the fact that neither of them work there nor have for a long time. So I feel okay saying this now. I can't begin to tell you how proud I am of all of the talent who worked on those projects, because they gave it their all. And they knew that at best it was a very severe grade to quote.
Now, some of those talents, Bill Loebs, Mark Waid, Rick Burchett, I mean, it goes on and on. There's so many talented, like I said, people who stuck by, and it showed.
Mike Fairbeck, Tom Lyle, I mean, geez, we had some Tom Hardis. We had some brilliant people, and we had our own art director. Mike Golden was our art director, and he did a fabulous job, which doesn't surprise people. He also had the same attitude in life as I do.
Right.
He still so. That probably scared people. He played a great practical joke on me once. He's from Nebraska. And I was leaving DC to go to a convention in Nebraska. And just before I go downstairs, to go to the airport, Mike comes up to me and says, did I ever mention to you that I'm still wanted for gun sales in Nebraska? I said, no, oddly enough, you never mentioned that. And he says, yeah, well, I just thought you should know because, Mike Golden, comic books, blah, blah, blah. I said, oh, thank you. Great guy to work with. I love seeing him. We hang out at conventions and still screw around with each other. It's fun. It's fun.
Did you get the sense that
Peter Pan complex?
What'd you say?
The Peter Pan complex.
Oh yes.
Syndrome. We won't grow up.
Right. Stay the same age.
That's right. There's this inner, 14-year-old inside of me who's been paying the rent for a millennium now. God bless him.
With DC, when they acquire properties from a different source, like they did with Impact, and a few years earlier they did from Charlton with The Question and Blue Beetle and stuff, do you feel there's a hesitancy to spotlight those characters because they are not original DC creations?
In the older days, yes, and that hung on for a long time, and probably still is part of the equation, but very, very small part, and down to a point where it's okay. It's okay to be proud of your heritage.
Right.
To have it close all these doors for you, that's wrong. Right. But now it's at a reasonable level. It has been for a while. But yeah, I think so. When EC Comics went out of business in the mid-50s, all of the greatest talent in comic books at that time were looking for work. Al Williamson, Wally Wood. You can't just, the list goes on and on. Just the most brilliant artists we've ever seen. And none of them could get work at DC because they were DC Comics. And that mentality hung on for a long time. It was what I had to fight in the 70s. Murray Boltinoff, who's a great guy, and he and I shared a background a generation apart because he got his start in journalism in Chicago, as did I. Well, journalism and radio, but I don't know if they had radio back then when he was a kid. And we're talking, and I really love the guy. But he was really wedded to the old philosophies. as you could tell from reading his books. He intuitively understood what Marvel was about. If you look at like Inferior 5, you realize he intuitively understood what Marvel was about, but he didn't know he understood it. He didn't think it was. He thought that the DC way was it, and everybody else is an upstart. And I said, "So you think that Marvel's just a fad?" He says, "Yeah, it's just." And I said, "Like the Beatles?" And he says, "Yeah." Okay. That's all you need to know. I respect and admire his work. But, DC was a survivor. It wasn't the best selling company. Fawcett outsold them. Captain Marvel was a much bigger character during the 40s than Superman, and even Superman had a better cereal, too. And, Marvel had hung on there. It wasn't a big player, but they were a survivor. And so the folks who survived Warfare, the folks who survived the death of all of the competition except for a small hand, they thought they were onto something. I get that. I probably would too. Mm-hmm. But these are also the people who, when they went home at night, they told their neighbors that they were in the commercial art business, they were in the comic business. So, well, given that moment in time back in the 50s, back in the Warping days, I don't fault them for that, because the comics people were child pornography on a good day. Yeah. As opposed to the ones who really were. I can only read 2 or 3 of them. Who I won't mention.
Yeah. Well, I want to be mindful of your time. I'd love to have you back on, because there's so much more to talk about. But as a fan and as someone who loved First Comics, loved Impact, and so many things you worked on, there's not enough thank yous for the risks you took. And there's always a mentality with the projects you worked on of putting the fans first, and putting out the best product possible, not just trying to fill a quota, but there was a quality and a love that really came through in everything you worked on.
Well, thank you for that. First of all, that means a lot to me. And I'm really Velling, they call it in New York. It's very nice. Thank you for that. But it's like getting in trouble. Okay, that inner 14-year-old, he can be a brat. At least the adult in me knows how to make him a brat for good.
That's right. Direct it in the right direction.
That's right.
That's all you got to do.
I would love to do a follow-up if you like. Just let me know, and of course we'll work it out and have a lot of false starts and stuff. But that's just who I am.
Not a problem. And where was a good place for fans to keep up with what you're up to, or social media or anything like that?
I have been writing for Pop Culture Squad, but that got a problem in terms of my time. I love writing more than almost anything else. I just love writing. So I would like to get back to it. I probably will. But Bob Harrison, who I mentioned before, Bob and I are going to start up a podcast, because people won't read. They listen. So we're going to start up a comics podcast. In fact, that Tom King, Mike Grell inner panel, we're going to cut that up and use that as sort of some of the beginning stuff of the podcast. That will start pretty soon. I think, well, certainly by the end of the year. I hope, assuming Russia doesn't bomb us.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
And we're back. Another great interview, Orrin. I don't know what to say. I mean, it's not like anyone's ever going to say, "Oh, it's just an Orrin only interview," and it sucks. No one's
We
ever
don't
said
know
that.
that. Maybe they do in their minds. I don't know.
No.
Why are we even here, Joe? Sometimes
I don't
I
know.
question.
That's a good question. You know what, guys? Signing off. No.
You add some flavor.
But seriously, great interview. What I enjoy about your interviews, Oren, specifically, is you really appreciate these creators and the characters that they work on, and it shows. Mike Gold has had a pretty interesting career. He's worked with some great talent. Mike Barron, Steve Rude, Mike Grell, one of your favorites. But I don't need to tell you that. You know who you love.
And he does a lot for his community as well. He's genuinely a nice guy, and he was somebody that was very high up on the target list when we started. It took a while for us to settle on a date, but we did, and I'm so glad that we did get to speak to Mike.
Kudos to you, Oren. Another great solo interview. Kudos to Mike Gold for a stellar career, including that influential founding of First Comics, which was amazing. All of the books, you can definitely check them out. I don't think there was a dud in there, and I wish it had lasted it even longer than it did. But that'll do it for another episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits. Thank you so much for listening. Please remember to rate, review, and subscribe if you want to help us grow. And we will see you next time.